He spent 2 years planning her downfall. At 60, she walked away with nothing. No house, no money, no future. 2 months later, he was in court, fighting for a box she almost threw away in a basement. But here's what makes this story different. She didn't lose everything in one moment. She lost it slowly, one signature at a time. And the night it all ended, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She sat in her car for 3 hours, trying to understand how 30 years could disappear that quietly. What she didn't know was this: the one thing her husband missed wasn't hidden. He just never believed it had any value. And that mistake is where everything changed. Because that box in the basement, it wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was something people had been searching for years without even knowing it still existed. And the craziest part? She almost walked away from it. If she had closed that cabinet, none of this would have happened. No business, no comeback, no courtroom, and definitely no downfall for the man who thought he had taken everything. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it for you right now? Comment below because I read every single comment. He spent 2 years planning his wife's downfall. And at 60, she walked away with nothing. The air in Chicago felt unusually heavy that evening, thick with late summer heat and a silence that didn't belong in a neighborhood this alive. Evelyn Carter sat behind the wheel of her aging silver sedan, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not trembling, just still, as if her body hadn't caught up to the reality her life had already accepted. She was a black woman in her early 60s, tall with a quiet, grounded presence, her deep brown skin soft under the glow of a streetlight, her natural hair pulled back into a low bun threaded with silver. Her face carried history, high cheekbones, tired but observant eyes, and a kind of calm that came from decades of showing up without being acknowledged. Tonight, that calm felt different. Not broken, just emptied. 3 hours earlier, she had walked out of the only home she had known for 30 years. Not in anger, not in confusion, just done. She had picked up her purse, her keys, and one thing she didn't even remember choosing, a worn notebook resting on the kitchen counter, and stepped outside like someone leaving a place that no longer belonged to her. She didn't cry. That surprised her. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain felt too large to move. It stayed inside, quiet, heavy, waiting. Across the street, the porch light of that same house still glowed. Through the window, a shadow moved. Richard, most likely on the phone, already back to business, already adjusting to a life that no longer included her, as if nothing significant had been removed. Richard Carter was a black man in his early 60s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a posture that suggested control even in stillness. His beard, salt and pepper and precisely trimmed, framed a jawline that rarely softened. He spoke with intention, never rushed, never loud, always calculated. People listened to him not because he demanded attention, but because he never seemed to need it. For years, Evelyn had believed that calm meant stability. Now she understood it differently. That calm wasn't kindness, it was strategy. Richard didn't leave Evelyn because she failed him. He left because he believed she no longer matched the life he had built. At 62, successful, respected, surrounded by younger associates who mirrored the future he imagined for himself, Evelyn had quietly shifted from partner to reminder. And Richard didn't build his life to look backward. So he planned. For 2 years. And the worst part? He didn't hide it. He didn't need to. The house had been refinanced years earlier. She remembered signing the papers at the kitchen table, half listening while asking what he wanted for dinner. The business accounts had been restructured. He called it efficiency. The savings moved. He called it opportunity. Every decision had an explanation. Every document had a reason. And she signed them all because she trusted him. Back in 1995, when everything was just beginning, Evelyn believed they were building something together. She didn't realize she was slowly signing herself out of it. By the time the divorce papers were placed in front of her, everything was already gone. The house, no longer hers. The accounts, no longer shared. The business? Never officially hers to begin with. $18,000. That's what 30 years had been reduced to. $18,000, an old car, and a notebook she hadn't opened in years. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. She didn't call anyone. Not her friends, not her children, not even herself. At some point, she stopped trying to understand him and started wondering when she stopped understanding herself. Because this didn't happen in one moment. It happened slowly, quietly, one signature at a time. She reached over and picked up the notebook from the passenger seat. The cover was worn, softened by time, edges rounded from years of being carried and forgotten in equal measure. Inside were pages filled with handwriting she hadn't seen in years, her grandmother's. Recipes, notes, small adjustments scribbled in the margins, written in a looping, careful script that always felt more like someone speaking than instructing. Evelyn hadn't thought about this notebook in a long time. Not really. It had just been there, like so many things she assumed would always be part of her life. She stared at it for a moment longer, then placed it back down. She didn't know yet what it meant. She didn't know yet what she still had. All she knew was this: Richard Carter believed he had taken everything, but sitting there in the quiet, with nothing left except a past that had just been erased, something unfamiliar began to take shape inside her. Not anger, not sadness, something else, something that didn't need permission, because what Richard didn't understand was that the one thing he missed wasn't hidden. It was something people had been searching for years, and when he finally realized it, it would already be too late. She didn't realize it that night, sitting in the car for 3 hours, but that silence was the first moment in 30 years that no one was directing her life. When Evelyn finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine didn't start right away, as if even the car needed a second to decide whether it still belonged to her. She tried again, slower this time, and the engine came alive with a low, tired rumble that matched the way she felt. Functional, but worn. She pulled away from the curb without looking back, not because she was strong, but because she understood something instinctively. There was nothing behind her anymore that could be taken twice. The streetlights blurred slightly as she drove, her vision steady but distant, like she was watching her own life from somewhere just outside of it. She didn't have a destination. That was new. For 30 years, there had always been a place she was expected to be. She drove until the houses changed. The quiet, polished neighborhood she had lived in gave way to older streets, faded storefronts, uneven sidewalks where the city had stopped trying to impress anyone. She slowed at a red light on the edge of a district she didn't recognize, the kind of place people passed through but didn't stop in. And for the first time that night, she noticed something outside of her own thoughts. A small, weathered sign hanging crooked above a narrow brick building. For sale. The letters were peeling, sun-faded, barely holding on to their shape. Evelyn didn't move when the light turned green. Something about the building held her attention longer than it should have. The windows were boarded, the door slightly off its hinges, paint chipped down to raw wood in places that hadn't seen care in years. It looked abandoned, but not forgotten. Not entirely. There was a presence to it, something quiet and unfinished, like a sentence that had been cut off before it could say what it meant. A car behind her honked. Evelyn pressed the gas and moved forward, but she didn't get far. 50 feet past the intersection, she pulled over again, this time without thinking about it. The engine stayed running as she sat there, her hands resting on the wheel, the same way they had been parked outside her house. Except now, there was something different beneath that stillness. Curiosity. Not loud, not urgent, but there. She turned the car off. The sudden quiet felt heavier than before, but not in the same way. Before, the silence had pressed inward. Now it seemed to open outward, like space she hadn't realized she needed. Evelyn stepped out of the car slowly, closing the door with a soft click that echoed faintly against the empty street. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of old brick and something metallic underneath, like rain that hadn't fallen yet. She walked toward the building. Up close, it looked worse than it had from the road. The glass in one of the front windows had cracked but hadn't shattered, spiderweb lines spreading outward from a single point of impact. The door handle was loose, turning slightly when she tested it, but still locked. A second sign was taped inside the window, smaller, handwritten. "Call for inquiries." A number was scribbled beneath it. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment. This wasn't a plan. This wasn't even an idea. It was just something. And for the first time in hours, something felt like movement. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and typed the number in slowly, like she expected it to disappear if she moved too fast. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a second longer than necessary. Then she pressed it. It rang twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone answered. "Yeah?" The voice was female, older, steady but guarded, the kind of tone that didn't waste energy on politeness unless it had to. "My name is Evelyn," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. "I'm calling about the property on—" "I know which one," the voice cut in, not unkind, just direct. "You standing outside it right now?" Evelyn glanced at the window, then at her reflection, faintly staring back at her. "Yes." There was a pause on the other end. Not suspicion. Assessment. "Name's Lillian Brooks," the woman said finally. "I've owned that place longer than I probably should have. You interested or just curious?" Evelyn almost said she didn't know, because she didn't. Instead, she said, "I'd like to see it." Another pause, shorter this time. "You got time tomorrow morning?" Lillian asked. "I do." 8 o'clock. Don't be late. I don't keep that door open for people who don't show up." The line clicked dead before Evelyn could respond. She lowered the phone slowly. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the building again, not as something abandoned, but as something waiting. Lillian Brooks was not a woman she could see yet, but she could hear her clearly in the way she spoke. Someone who had learned to rely on herself, someone who didn't extend opportunity twice. The kind of person who had probably been disappointed enough times to stop dressing things up. Evelyn understood that kind of person. She had just become one. A faint sound broke the silence behind her. She turned slightly and saw a dog sitting near the edge of the sidewalk, a medium-sized mixed breed, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with a patchy brown coat and one ear that didn't stand up the way it was supposed to. Its ribs showed slightly beneath its fur, not dangerously thin, but not cared for either. It watched her with quiet attention, not approaching, not afraid, just present. Evelyn held its gaze for a second. "You been here a while?" she asked softly. The dog didn't move, didn't need to. Something about that stillness felt familiar. Evelyn exhaled slowly and looked back at the building. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what this would become. All she knew was that for the first time since everything ended, she wasn't reacting. She was choosing. And that was new. She turned, walked back to her car, and this time when she sat down, the silence didn't feel like something closing in on her. It felt like something waiting for her to fill it. Because what Evelyn didn't understand yet was that this wasn't just a building. And it wasn't just a phone call. It was the first decision she had made in 30 years that no one else had written for her. And by the time she realized what she had just stepped into, it would already be too late to walk away. 2 weeks after losing everything, she made a decision that no one around her could understand, and that was exactly why it mattered. By the time Evelyn Carter stood in front of the building again, the early morning light had stripped away whatever mystery the night had given it. In daylight, the place looked even less promising. The brick exterior was unevenly faded, the sign above the door barely readable under layers of dust and time, and the windows, though no longer boarded, revealed a dim interior that felt more like a memory than a business. This was not the kind of place people invested in. This was the kind of place people walked past without slowing down. And yet, Evelyn didn't walk past. She stood still, hands resting at her sides, her posture straight but quiet, as if she had already made peace with how this looked to everyone else. She wore a simple navy blouse tucked into dark slacks, nothing that suggested she was about to make a life-altering purchase, nothing that drew attention. But there was something in her expression now that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. Not confidence, not certainty, but intention. The kind that didn't need to explain itself. The door opened behind her. "You showed up," a voice said. Evelyn turned. Lillian Brooks stepped out onto the sidewalk, pulling the door closed behind her with a firm, practiced motion. She was a black woman in her late 70s, shorter than Evelyn but solid in her stance, with a presence that made her seem larger than her frame. Her skin was a deep, weathered brown, her gray hair cut close to her head in a style that spoke more of practicality than preference. Her eyes were sharp, observant, the kind that missed very little and trusted even less. She wore a long beige coat despite the warmth, its fabric worn but clean, and her hands, strong, steady, carried the memory of years spent working, building, holding things together long after others had let go. "I don't waste mornings," Lillian added, watching Evelyn closely. "So if you're here, I'm assuming you're serious." Evelyn nodded once. "I am." Lillian studied her for a moment longer, not just looking at her, but measuring something. Resolve, maybe, or the absence of hesitation. Whatever she was searching for, she must have found enough of it, because she turned and unlocked the door without another question. "Then come see what you're buying," she said. The inside smelled like thyme. Not unpleasant, but heavy. Layers of flour, sugar, and something faintly burnt lingering beneath it, as if the space itself remembered every recipe that had ever passed through it. The main room was small, with a counter that ran along one side and a few scattered tables pushed against the walls. Dust had settled into the corners, and the equipment, old ovens, mixers, metal racks, stood where they had been left, untouched for years. It wasn't destroyed, just paused. Evelyn walked slowly, her eyes moving over everything without rushing. She didn't see what it was. She saw what it had been and what it could be. Lillian watched her from near the door, arms folded loosely across her chest. "Been trying to sell this place for 4 years," she said. "People come in, take a look, start doing math in their heads. Cost of repairs, foot traffic, location. Then they leave." She shrugged slightly. "Can't blame them. Numbers don't look good." Evelyn stopped near the counter, resting her hand lightly against its surface. The wood was worn smooth in places where hands had touched it over and over again. "Why didn't you close it completely?" she asked. Lillian's gaze shifted, just slightly. "Because closing something ain't the same as finishing it," she said. "Some things, you don't shut down, you just step away." There was a story in that sentence. Evelyn didn't ask for it. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned back toward the center of the room. "How much?" she asked. Lillian didn't answer immediately. She walked forward, her steps slow but deliberate, and stopped a few feet away from Evelyn. 25,000, she said. "That's the number. Been the number for a while." Evelyn nodded once. She had 18, plus what she could pull together by letting go of everything else she still had. For a brief moment, just one, something inside her hesitated. Not fear, memory. 30 years of thinking carefully, planning, calculating, asking what made sense. This didn't, and that was exactly why she couldn't walk away. "I can do 21, Evelyn said. Lillian's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. Recognition, maybe, or respect. She didn't negotiate, didn't counter. "Done," she said. Just like that, no paperwork yet, no signatures, just a decision. Evelyn exhaled slowly, as if something inside her had just been released without asking permission first. People said it didn't make sense. They were right, but Evelyn wasn't thinking like people anymore. If I have nothing left, I have nothing to lose. Lillian nodded toward the back. "There's more you should see," she said. "Didn't bother showing most folks. They didn't make it this far anyway." Evelyn followed her. The hallway narrowed as they moved deeper into the building, the light dimming with each step. At the end, a door stood closed, its surface worn, a simple lock holding it shut. Lillian reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small key that looked older than the building itself. "This room's been closed a long time," she said. "Didn't know what to do with what's in there. Didn't feel right throwing it out." She paused, her hand resting on the lock. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Maybe you will." Evelyn didn't respond, but something inside her shifted again, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like the moment before a memory surfaces fully. The key turned, the lock clicked, the door opened, and whatever was waiting on the other side wasn't just part of the building. It was something that had been waiting specifically for her. She almost walked away from the door, and if she had, nothing that followed would have ever existed. The air beyond the threshold felt cooler, heavier, like it had been holding its breath for years. A single bulb flickered somewhere deeper inside, casting a faint, uneven glow across the narrow staircase leading down. The wooden steps creaked under the weight of time more than the weight of footsteps, each one carrying a low echo that lingered longer than it should have. Evelyn paused at the top, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, her body still, her mind not. There was something about this moment that felt deliberate, not accidental, not random, like the kind of choice that only looks small until you understand what it opens. Behind her, Lillian Brooks didn't speak. She stood with her arms folded, her posture steady, her eyes fixed not on the room but on Evelyn, watching, not pushing, not explaining, just waiting to see what kind of woman Evelyn was going to be. Evelyn took the first step down, then another. The smell changed as she descended, less of the bakery above, more of something older, quieter, wood, dust, and something faintly sweet underneath, like a memory that hadn't fully disappeared. By the time her feet reached the bottom, the light had stabilized just enough to reveal the space. A low-ceilinged basement, walls lined with shelves that held scattered boxes, old equipment, and things that had clearly been left behind without a final decision. At the far end of the room, against the back wall, stood a wooden cabinet. It wasn't large, it wasn't impressive, but it didn't belong to the rest of the space. The wood was darker, polished once but now dulled by time, its edges worn smooth not by neglect but by use. A small lock hung at the front, already opened, the metal slightly rusted but intact. There was no dust on the handle. Someone had cared about this, at some point. Evelyn walked toward it slowly, her steps quiet, her attention narrowing in a way she hadn't felt in years. She didn't rush, not because she was afraid, but because something inside her understood that whatever was waiting there had already waited long enough. Her fingers touched the cabinet door. For a brief moment, she hesitated, not out of doubt, but recognition. Then she opened it. Inside, 27 glass jars, each one carefully sealed, arranged in rows that had not shifted over time. The glass had clouded slightly, but not enough to hide what was inside. A deep, rich purple preserve that seemed almost untouched by the years. And on each jar, a label, handwritten, faded but still legible. Margaret's Reserve, 1979. Evelyn didn't move. Her hand remained on the cabinet door, her fingers tightening slightly as if she needed something physical to hold on to. Her breathing changed, not faster, not slower, just different, like her body had recognized something before her mind could catch up. This wasn't inventory. This wasn't abandoned stock. This was her grandmother. The name alone carried a weight that pressed against her chest in a way she couldn't explain. Margaret Carter had been a woman of quiet precision, tall and composed, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that missed nothing. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened. Not because she demanded it, but because her words carried the certainty of someone who had already tested them against reality. She had raised Evelyn in a small kitchen where recipes weren't written at first. They were remembered, adjusted, perfected through repetition and patience. Margaret didn't believe in shortcuts. She believed in knowing exactly what something needed before you gave it to anyone else. And this was hers. Evelyn reached forward and lifted one of the jars. It was heavier than she expected, solid, real, not fragile the way memories usually felt. She turned it slightly, reading the label again, tracing the faint curve of the handwriting with her eyes, not her fingers. She didn't need to touch it to know it was real. Beneath the jars, partially hidden by the wooden shelf, something else caught her attention. Paper. Stacked. Organized. Waiting. Evelyn set the jar back down carefully and reached underneath, pulling out a bundle of documents tied together with a thin piece of twine that had aged but not broken. She untied it slowly, the motion deliberate, her focus sharp now in a way that had nothing to do with the room around her. The first page was a letter, handwritten, addressed to someone named Delia. Evelyn frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to her. Not yet. She flipped to the next page. Another letter, then another. Correspondence, dates spanning years, mentions of shipments, quantities, feedback, requests. This wasn't personal writing. This was business. Underneath the letters were typed documents, contracts, signed, stamped, official. Evelyn's eyes moved faster now, scanning, absorbing, connecting pieces that hadn't been presented to her directly, but were forming something undeniable. Ownership agreements, production rights, distribution terms, and at the bottom of each one, a name, Margaret Carter, and beneath it, language that was clear, specific, and impossible to misinterpret, transferred to direct heirs. Evelyn's grip tightened slightly on the papers. Her mind didn't race. It aligned, piece by piece. This wasn't just something her grandmother had made. This was something her grandmother had built, and somehow it had ended up here, hidden but not lost, forgotten but not gone. Behind her, the sound of Lillian shifting her weight broke the silence just enough to remind Evelyn she wasn't alone. "I told you," Lillian said quietly. "Didn't know what it was worth. Just knew it wasn't mine to throw away." Evelyn didn't respond, not because she didn't hear her, but because for the first time since everything had ended, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what had never left her. She looked back at the cabinet, at the jars, at the name, and something settled inside her. Not hope, not yet. Something steadier, something that didn't need to prove itself to exist. Because what Richard Carter had taken had been visible, transferable, documented. But this had been waiting, unseen, untouched, unclaimed. And the moment he realized what it was would be the moment he understood what he had truly missed. By the time the lawyer finished reading the documents, everything Evelyn thought she understood about her past had already started to rearrange itself into something else. The office was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty, but controlled. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with case files and law books that had been opened and closed enough times to lose their stiffness. The faint scent of paper and coffee lingered in the air. Across the desk sat Vanessa Cole, a black woman in her early 40s, composed and deliberate, with a presence that didn't need to raise its voice to command attention. She wore her hair in a sleek, shoulder-length style, straightened but thick with natural volume, framing a face defined by sharp cheekbones and steady eyes that missed nothing. Her skin was a warm, even tone, and her expression carried the kind of focus that came from years of seeing people walk in with problems they didn't fully understand yet. Vanessa had built her reputation not on dramatic courtroom moments, but on precision, the ability to find what others overlooked and hold it steady until it mattered. She didn't rush. She read everything, twice. Page by page, line by line, her eyes moving with a rhythm that made it clear she wasn't just scanning, she was verifying. Evelyn sat across from her, hands folded loosely in her lap, her posture straight but not tense. The notebook rested beside her on the desk, closed now, but no less present. She hadn't said much since handing over the documents, not because she didn't have questions, but because something inside her told her to wait. Vanessa placed the final page down carefully, aligning it with the others before looking up. For a brief moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at Evelyn, not judging, not doubting, measuring. Then she leaned back slightly in her chair. "This brand was registered in 1979, she said, her voice calm, precise. Evelyn nodded once. "You got married in 1995. Another pause. Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "This is not marital property." The words settled into the room without needing emphasis. "This is yours," she added, "entirely." Evelyn didn't react immediately, not because she didn't understand, but because understanding something and feeling it land are two different things. For a second, she simply sat there, absorbing the weight of a sentence that didn't sound dramatic, but carried more consequence than anything she had heard in the past 2 weeks. Entirely. No division, no negotiation, no signatures required to take it away. Just hers. Vanessa continued, her tone shifting slightly, not more intense, but more focused, as if moving from confirmation into implication. "These agreements are clean," she said. "Your grandmother retained full ownership, and the clause transferring rights to direct heirs is explicit. No ambiguity, no shared claim, no loophole that I can see from his side." She didn't say Richard's name. She didn't need to. Evelyn's fingers moved slightly against each other, a small, unconscious motion, as if grounding herself in something physical while everything else adjusted internally. "So he can't touch it," Evelyn said quietly. Vanessa didn't hesitate. "No," she replied. "He can try, but he won't win." That wasn't confidence. That was certainty. For the first time since everything had happened, Evelyn felt something shift, not outward, not visible, but internal. Not relief, not satisfaction, alignment. Because this wasn't about getting something back. This was about realizing something had never been taken. Vanessa reached forward and lightly tapped one of the documents. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Evelyn looked at the page again. "A recipe?" she said. Vanessa shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "It's a product, and not just any product." She leaned back again, folding her hands together. "For years, people have been trying to recreate this," she continued. "I recognize the name. Not widely commercialized, but it's circulated in certain circles. Small batch food distributors, private buyers, high-end kitchens. There are references to it in trade publications going back decades." Evelyn's brow tightened slightly. "I've never heard of it," she said. "That's the point," Vanessa replied. She leaned forward just enough to close the space between explanation and understanding. It was never mass-produced, which means the supply was always limited. And when something is limited, consistent, and tied to a specific origin, she paused briefly, letting the logic complete itself, it becomes valuable. Not trendy, not popular, valuable. There was a difference. Evelyn looked down at the documents again, but this time she wasn't reading them the same way. Before, they had been information. Now, they were structure, proof, something that existed outside of her memory of her grandmother and stood on its own, independent of sentiment. This wasn't just something Margaret Carter had made in a kitchen. This was something she had protected, built, positioned, and then, without anyone fully understanding it, left behind. Vanessa studied Evelyn for another moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of a turning point. "Let me ask you something," she said. Evelyn looked up. "When you found this, did anyone else see it?" Evelyn shook her head. "No." Vanessa nodded once. "Good," she said. The word landed with more weight than expected. "Because the moment this becomes visible," she continued, "it stops being just yours in practice, even if it's yours legally. People notice value, especially the kind that doesn't announce itself." She didn't need to explain further. They both knew who that included. Evelyn leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze steady now, her breathing even. Richard didn't miss this because it was hidden. He missed it because he never believed she had anything worth finding. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, the kind that didn't need to be defended. Vanessa gathered the documents into a neat stack, sliding them gently toward Evelyn. "You need to decide what you want to do with this," she said. Not quickly, but carefully. Evelyn placed her hand over the papers. For the first time since she had opened that cabinet, the question in front of her wasn't about what this was. It was about what it could become. And that question was bigger than anything Richard had ever planned for. Because while he had spent 2 years preparing to take everything from her, he had never prepared for the possibility that she was still holding something he couldn't even recognize. And when he did, it wouldn't just be too late to take it, it would be too late to stop what it was about to become. 2 months after she bought the place, the thing no one expected finally started happening, and it didn't ask for permission. At first, nothing changed in a way anyone would notice. The mornings were quiet, almost stubbornly so, the kind of silence that made time feel longer than it was. Evelyn opened the bakery at the same hour every day, her movements precise but unhurried, her presence steady behind the counter, that had started to feel less like a surface and more like a line she had crossed. A few customers wandered in, curious, cautious, the kind of people who didn't trust something new until it proved it deserved to exist. Some stayed, most didn't. The days passed like that, quiet, measured, real. But Evelyn wasn't watching the door anymore. She was watching the process. Her hands moved with a familiarity that had returned faster than she expected, guided not by memory alone, but by something deeper, instinct shaped years before she ever understood its value. The recipes weren't just instructions. They were conversations she had learned to listen to again. The first time she opened one of the jars from the basement, the smell alone had been enough to stop her mid-motion. Rich, layered, not loud, but unmistakable. It wasn't sweetness that defined it. It was balance, precision, something that couldn't be rushed or replicated by guesswork. And that's what people began to notice. Not all at once, but enough. The first post came from someone Evelyn didn't know, a young woman named Tasha Green, mid-20s, tall and lean with smooth, dark skin and long braids that fell down her back, had a habit of documenting everything she experienced through her phone. Tasha wasn't famous, but she had something more important, attention. Her content wasn't polished, but it was honest, and people trusted that. She walked into the bakery one afternoon, ordered without expectation, and recorded the moment casually, like she did everything else. What she didn't expect was the pause that followed the first bite. That pause stayed in the video. She didn't exaggerate, she didn't perform, she just looked at the jar, then back at the camera, and said quietly, "I don't know what this is, but I've never tasted anything like it." That was enough. The video spread, not explosively, not in a way that made headlines, but steadily, consistently, the way something real tends to move when it doesn't need to convince anyone. Then another post appeared. Then another. Different people, same reaction. Confusion first, then recognition of something they couldn't quite explain but didn't want to forget. The flavor did what advertising couldn't. It stayed. Within weeks, the pattern shifted. The quiet mornings didn't disappear, but they started later. The afternoons grew louder. People didn't just walk in anymore. They came looking. Some brought friends. Others came back with questions, not about the bakery, but about the product. What is this? Where did you learn this? Can I buy more? Evelyn didn't rush her answers. She didn't expand too quickly. She didn't try to match the pace of the attention. She just stayed consistent. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't reacting to what was happening around her. She was letting it come to her. And it did. The line didn't appear overnight. It formed slowly. A few people waiting outside before opening. Then more. Then people who arrived early just to make sure they didn't miss it. The kind of line that didn't need to be explained, because people trust what other people are willing to wait for. Inside, the space felt different now. Warmer. Not because of the ovens, but because of the energy moving through it. Conversations overlapped. Laughter carried. The counter that had once separated Evelyn from the room now connected her to it. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she didn't need to prove anything to be seen. Then one morning, without warning, without build-up, a different kind of attention arrived. The article wasn't long. It didn't try to be, but it was written by someone who knew what mattered. Marcus Hale, a food columnist in his late 40s, known not for trends but for restraint, had built his reputation on recognizing quality before it became popular. He was a tall man with a lean frame, his dark complexion framed by a neatly kept beard that softened the sharpness of his jaw. His voice, when he spoke in interviews, carried a quiet certainty that made people listen carefully, because he rarely spoke without intention. Years earlier, a review he wrote had turned a small restaurant into a national name, not overnight, but inevitably. He had come into the bakery without announcing himself. He had ordered like everyone else, and he had left without saying a word. Until the article appeared. It mentioned the location briefly, the owner even less, but it centered on one thing: Margaret's Reserve, not as a product, as a rediscovery. The language was simple but precise. A flavor that doesn't feel new but feels remembered. The kind of thing that reminds you that some recipes aren't created to compete, they're created to last. That was all it took. Across the city, Richard Carter saw the name, and everything stopped. He wasn't looking for it. He wasn't thinking about Evelyn, not in any way that mattered. But when the name appeared, clear, unmistakable, something in his attention shifted immediately. Recognition without context. He leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged at first, his mind already moving ahead of the moment. At first, he smiled, not because he understood, but because he assumed he did. Then he checked the numbers: traffic, engagement, mentions, then the projections, growth curves, demand patterns, scalability, and that's when the smile disappeared. Because what he was looking at wasn't random, it wasn't temporary, and it definitely wasn't small. This was something structured, something with momentum, something that could be turned into something bigger than the space it came from. And that's when Richard Carter realized something he hadn't considered before. Evelyn hadn't just started over. She had stepped into something he had never seen coming. And the moment he understood what it could become was the moment he stopped seeing it as hers. He didn't call her, he didn't apologize, and he didn't try to understand. He moved the only way he ever had, quietly and with intent. And when Richard Carter decided something mattered, he didn't reach for it with emotion. He reached for it with law. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, slid across Evelyn's counter between the smell of fresh bread and the low murmur of customers who had started to recognize her by name. The envelope was plain, official in a way that didn't need to announce itself, and the moment she saw the return address, she didn't need to open it to know who had sent it. Her fingers didn't shake as she broke the seal, but something inside her tightened. Not fear, not even anger, just recognition of a pattern she had lived inside for most of her adult life. Richard didn't confront, he structured. And when something didn't belong to him, he found a way to make it look like it did. The claim was simple on paper. The brand had been discovered during the dissolution period of their marriage. Therefore, it was subject to division. It was clean, technical, designed to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know what had been left out. Evelyn folded the papers once, neatly, then set them down on the counter beside the register. Around her, the bakery moved forward. Orders called, trays shifted, voices layered into the kind of sound that meant something was working. 2 months ago, this space had been silent. Now it carried weight, not just business, presence. And in the middle of it, Evelyn stood still for a moment longer than necessary, not deciding what to do, but remembering something she had already learned. Richard only fought for things he believed he could win, which meant he believed this was his. Vanessa Cole didn't react when she read the filing. She sat in the same chair, in the same office, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, her eyes moving across the document with the same precision she had shown before. But there was something different this time. Not tension, not concern, just a sharper focus, as if the situation had moved from theoretical to inevitable. Vanessa had seen this pattern before, not with Evelyn specifically, but with men like Richard. Men who had built entire systems around control and didn't know how to exist outside of it. "He's not arguing ownership," Vanessa said finally, setting the paper down. "He's arguing timing." Evelyn leaned slightly forward. "And that matters?" Vanessa's lips pressed together for a brief second before she shook her head. "Not in the way he needs it to." She turned the document back toward Evelyn, tapping a section near the bottom. "He's saying the asset became visible during the marriage, but that's not what the law looks at. It looks at origin, and origin is clear." Vanessa didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 1979, she said, brand established. 1995, she added, marriage. A pause, then simply, he doesn't have a claim. Evelyn exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of recognition. This wasn't the moment she had been waiting for. It was the moment she had already stepped into, the second she opened that cabinet. The courtroom was colder than she expected, not in temperature, but in tone. Everything inside it felt measured, controlled, stripped of anything that didn't serve the process. Richard stood across from her, exactly as she remembered him. Immaculate suit, posture straight, expression composed to the point of indifference. If someone didn't know him, they would see confidence. Evelyn saw something else. Expectation. He still believed this would work. His lawyer stood beside him, a tall man in his 50s named Gregory Sloane, with narrow features and a voice that carried just enough sharpness to cut through a room without sounding aggressive. Gregory had built his reputation on dismantling arguments, not people, and he approached this case the same way, methodically, efficiently, without wasted motion. To him, this wasn't personal, it was structure. And structure, when built correctly, usually held. But not this time. Vanessa didn't argue loudly. She didn't interrupt. She waited. Then she stood, her voice even, her words precise, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. The origin of the asset predates the marriage, she said. The ownership was legally assigned to direct heirs before the marital period. There is no joint claim, no shared development, no legal basis for division. She didn't expand. She didn't need to. The judge, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and a gaze that had seen more arguments than she cared to remember, looked down at the documents for a moment longer than anyone else in the room. Her expression didn't change. She didn't react to tone. She reacted to clarity. And this was clear. She closed the file. Case dismissed. No hesitation, no discussion, just finality. For a brief moment, the room held its breath. Gregory Sloane didn't move immediately. His expression remained controlled, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but undeniable. Richard, however, didn't react at all, not outwardly. He stood there, still composed, still measured, as if the outcome hadn't landed yet. But Evelyn saw it. Not on his face, in his stillness, because for the first time in 30 years, something hadn't gone according to his structure. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, not lighter, just real. Vanessa stepped beside Evelyn, her expression unchanged, but her tone slightly softer. "This should be the end," she said. Evelyn nodded once, but something inside her didn't agree, not because she was afraid, but because she understood Richard, and men like him didn't stop when they lost. They adjusted. They looked for another angle, another structure, another way in. Evelyn looked back at the courthouse doors for a brief second, then turned away, because what Richard had just lost wasn't just a case, it was access. And men who lose access don't walk away quietly. He thought losing the case would be the worst part. He was wrong. For a few days after the dismissal, Richard Carter moved exactly the way he always had, controlled, composed, deliberate. His schedule didn't change, his tone didn't change, his posture didn't change. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a temporary inconvenience, a miscalculation he would correct the way he had corrected everything else in his life. That had always been his advantage. He didn't react. He adjusted. And for 30 years, that had been enough. But this time, something didn't adjust with him. It stayed. The first sign wasn't loud. It was distance. Calls that used to be returned within minutes now took hours, then days, then not at all. Meetings that had once been easy to schedule became complicated. Not canceled, just postponed, repositioned, moved into the future in a way that suggested the present was no longer certain. Richard noticed it, of course he did. He noticed everything. But what he couldn't immediately locate was the source. Because for the first time in his career, the problem wasn't visible. It wasn't a number he could recalculate. It wasn't a contract he could restructure. It was perception. And perception, once it shifts, doesn't move back. Andre Whitaker didn't announce what he found. He didn't confront Richard, didn't demand explanations, didn't try to negotiate anything that had already become clear. Andre was the kind of man who believed that truth didn't need volume, it needed direction. And once he understood the pattern, he didn't hesitate. The report moved quietly, but it moved fast. Regulators didn't arrive with noise. They arrived with precision. Requests turned into subpoenas, subpoenas into timelines, timelines into connections that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence anymore. The same contracts Richard had used to take everything from Evelyn, the same structures he had trusted for decades, were now being read differently. Not as strategy, as evidence. And once that shift happened, there was no structure left to protect him. Within weeks, the firm began to fracture. Not publicly at first, quietly. A partner stepping back, a client reevaluating, another choosing to wait and see. But waiting doesn't stop momentum. It confirms it. And momentum, once it moves in the wrong direction, doesn't slow down. It accelerates. Richard didn't panic. He didn't break. But something inside him began to tighten. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone could name, but internally, in the space where certainty used to sit. Because for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't controlling the direction of what was happening. He was reacting to it. The suspension came next. Temporary, pending review. But in his world, temporary didn't exist, only perception. And once that word attached itself to his name, it stayed. Clients didn't need confirmation. They needed distance. The firm dissolved the way something hollow does, not collapsing all at once, but losing structure until nothing holds. Offices emptied. Conversations stopped. His name, once spoken with confidence, became something people avoided not out of disrespect, but out of recognition, because everyone in that room understood something he hadn't yet fully accepted. He wasn't untouchable anymore. For the first time in 30 years, Richard Carter had to ask for help. He made the calls, carefully at first, then directly. Former partners, long-term clients, people who had built their own success standing next to his. He didn't beg. He didn't explain. He simply reached out the way someone does when they assume history will carry weight. It didn't. The calls didn't go unanswered. They went unreturned. And that difference was louder than anything anyone could have said. The woman he had left Evelyn for didn't argue, didn't accuse, didn't even confront him. She left the same way he had left Evelyn, quietly, without explanation. And for the first time, he understood what absence actually felt like. Not dramatic, not explosive, just complete. Meanwhile, across the city, in a space that had once been overlooked, Evelyn Carter didn't change her pace. The bakery didn't explode overnight. It grew, steadily, consistently. The line outside wasn't about hype anymore. It was about return. People came back, not because they were curious, but because they knew. Inside, the air carried something deeper than success. It carried continuity, the kind that doesn't depend on attention to exist. Evelyn moved through the space the same way she always had, measured, grounded, aware of everything without needing to control any of it. She didn't check numbers. She didn't chase expansion. She didn't try to become something else, because she didn't need to. She already was. One afternoon, weeks later, something happened that no one planned for, and no one announced. In a grocery store on the other side of the city, on a shelf that had once held products designed to compete, a single row of jars appeared. Simple label, clean design, no exaggeration. Margaret's Reserve. Richard Carter stood in that aisle longer than he needed to. He hadn't come for this. He hadn't come for anything related to her. But there it was, visible, real. Placed in a space where value is measured by presence, not argument. He reached for one of the jars, picked it up, turned it slowly in his hand, reading. Not the ingredients, not the description, the name. And just beneath it, for the first time, hers, Evelyn Carter. There was no reaction on his face, not shock, not anger, just stillness, the kind that comes when something finally makes sense, too late to change it. He set the jar back down exactly where he found it, not out of respect, out of recognition, because for the first time in 30 years, there was nothing left he could take. He spent his life building a system where everything had a value, a structure, a way to be owned, controlled, transferred. Evelyn built something else, something that didn't need to be protected to exist, something that didn't depend on being seen to matter. He thought he was taking everything from her. He didn't realize He was removing himself from the only thing that made his life work. And by the time he understood that, she had already built something he could never touch. Be honest. Do people deserve a second chance after they show you exactly who they are? Yes or no, and why? Some people spend their lives chasing what they can own: money, power, control. But the most valuable things, they don't look valuable at first. They don't demand attention. They don't prove themselves on paper. They just sit there, waiting. And the wrong people, they walk right past them, until one day, it's too late. Not because it disappeared, but because they finally understood it, after they lost everything that truly mattered.